In the village of Kohler, Wisconsin, there is a hotel where a room can cost you $500 or $600 a night. It is one of the finest resorts in the American Midwest, a 5-star, 5-diamond hotel, a long, handsome Tudor building of brick and timber, with a celebrated restaurant and a spa and, of course, given who built it, the most beautiful bathrooms you have ever seen. Guests come from all over the country. They wear the robes and they take the spa treatments and they walk the immaculate grounds. And on their way to the pub, they pass through a corridor the hotel calls the Hall of Immigrants, full of old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings and framed citizenship papers, a charming bit of local colour to browse on the way to dinner. Almost none of them understand what they are looking at, or where just they are standing, because this building was not built as a hotel. It was built in 1918 as a dormitory for single immigrant men who worked in the factory across the street, labourers from Austria and Germany and Russia and a dozen other countries who came to America with nothing and lived, up to 300 at a time in this building, for $27.50 a month, which bought them a bed, 3 meals, a barbershop, a bowling alley, a pub, and something stranger, which was lessons, English lessons, and classes to prepare them to become American citizens. The guests today, paying $600 a night, are sleeping in the rooms where immigrant factory workers once slept for less than $30 a month, and the citizenship papers framed on the wall for their entertainment belong to real men who really lived in these rooms and really worked across the street making bathtubs. The hotel is called the American Club, and it was named that on purpose because its entire original function was to turn immigrants into Americans. Now it turns their memory into a luxury amenity. That reversal, the dormitory become a 5-star hotel, the workers become the decor, is the whole story of Kohler, Wisconsin compressed into one building. And to understand it, you have to understand something that almost no story about company towns ever tells you, because it does not fit the usual shape. The usual shape is simple: a cruel factory owner, exploited workers, a heroic union, a fight. You have heard it 100 times. Kohler is not that story. Kohler is stranger and more uncomfortable than that story, and it is more uncomfortable precisely because the family that built this town was not cruel. They were kind, genuinely, sincerely, elaborately kind. They built one of the most beautiful and generous company towns that has ever existed in America, out of real conviction that they were doing right by their workers, and they were, in 100 visible ways, doing right by their workers, and it still took 2 of the longest and bitterest strikes in the entire history of American labour to break the arrangement. One of them, the strike that started in 1954, remains the single longest major strike in the history of the United States. And this is the thing this whole video is about. It was so hard to break, not in spite of the kindness, but because of it. The kindness was the cage, the gift and the control were the same act, and the family that built it could not tell the difference because to them, generosity and ownership were one single feeling, and they had felt it their whole lives. To understand that feeling, you have to start with a horse trough. In 1873, a young Austrian immigrant named John Michael Kohler bought a struggling iron and steel foundry in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, a small town on the shore of Lake Michigan, about 50 miles north of Milwaukee. He had come to America as a 10-year-old boy from a village in the Austrian Tyrol, and he had made his way, as immigrants did, through work and salesmanship, and now he owned a foundry, bought in the middle of a financial panic, that made agricultural equipment, plows, harrows, castings, cemetery ornaments, railroad parts. For 10 years, that is what the Kohler Company was, a maker of farm tools and grave markers. It is worth pausing on how unlikely the whole thing was, because the improbability shaped the family's character permanently. John Michael Kohler bought that foundry in 1873, which was, of all the years to start a business, one of the worst in American history. A financial panic hit the country in September of that year, and touched off a depression that would grind on for the rest of the decade. A great many businesses founded in 1873 simply died. Kohler's did not, because he worked, and because he had the immigrants' particular relationship to work, the sense that there is no floor beneath you, no family estate to fall back on, nothing between you and ruin except your own effort. That sense never left the family, and it is the root of both their virtues and their flaws. It made them hard workers and careful stewards, and sincerely sympathetic to other immigrants, because they had been immigrants themselves and remembered it. And it also made them people who could not imagine letting go of anything they had built, because they knew, in a way inherited wealth never knows, just how much had gone into building it, and how easily it could all vanish. A family that has clawed its way up from a foundry bought in a panic does not easily believe that anyone has a right to any of it except the family that bled for it. That conviction built the town. It also, later, refused to settle the strike. And then, in 1883, John Michael Kohler did the small, strange thing that made everything else possible. He took a cast-iron trough, the kind of thing a farmer would use to water livestock or scald hogs, and he coated it in baked enamel, a smooth, hard, white, glassy finish. And he stood it on legs and called it a bathtub. That is the literal origin of the Kohler Company as the world knows it. The first Kohler bathtub was a horse trough with enamel on it, and that origin matters more than it seems, because think about what it represents. He took a rough object made for animals, and he made it clean and white and civilized, and put it inside the American home. He was in the business from that first tub of turning the rough into the refined, of cleanliness, of civilization, of taking something raw and making it fit for a proper American house. He would spend the rest of his life in that business, and so would his sons, and eventually they would do to an entire town, and to the immigrants who lived in it, just what John Michael Kohler had done to that trough. They would take the rough material and make it clean and refined and American and beautiful. Whether the trough had asked to be a bathtub was not a question anyone thought to raise, and the bathtub itself belongs to a bigger story that the Kohlers were riding, which is the story of cleanliness as an American idea. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cleanliness became almost a moral crusade in America. Indoor plumbing, the private bathroom, hot running water, the porcelain tub, these were not just conveniences. They were markers of civilization, of respectability, of being a proper modern American, as opposed to a dirty immigrant fresh off the boat. To have a bathroom was to have arrived, and the reformers of the era were explicit about it, aiming their cleanliness campaigns squarely at the immigrant poor, teaching them to bathe, to scrub, to be, in a word, Americanized. Kohler was at the very center of that. The company made the porcelain altar of the cleanliness religion, the enameled tub, and sold it into millions of American bathrooms, and the family applied the same idea to its own workers. The immigrant laborer, like the horse trough, was raw material to be cleaned up, refined, coated in something smooth and white and American, and installed in a proper place. The English classes, the citizenship courses, the beautiful orderly town with its aesthetic review board, were all in a sense an enameling process applied to human beings. Take the rough immigrant and make him clean, and orderly, and American, and fit for a good house. It was done with real kindness. It was also, unmistakably, done to people rather than with them. John Michael Kohler died in 1900, and in a piece of grim timing that the family would later treat almost as scripture, the plant burned to the ground a few months after his death. It was rebuilt within a year, and after the deaths of two of his brothers, the company passed to his son, Walter J. Kohler, and Walter is the man who built the town. Walter Kohler took over a growing plumbing company at a moment when America was building bathrooms as fast as it could. The scale of that opportunity is hard to overstate. In the space of a few decades around the turn of the century, the private bathroom went from a rarity found only in the homes of the rich to a standard feature that every new middle-class house was expected to have. Millions of homes were being built or upgraded, and every one of them needed a tub, a sink, a toilet. A company that made good, affordable, mass-produced enameled fixtures was standing in front of one of the great consumer waves of American history, and Kohler rode it expertly, growing from a regional foundry into a national name. The bathtub that had started as a coated horse trough became a whole industrial enterprise, and the enterprise needed a workforce to match, which is the problem that led Walter to the fields along the Sheboygan River in the first place. America was building bathrooms as fast as it could, and Walter Kohler intended to build a great many of them, which meant he needed workers, a lot of them, mostly immigrants, and he needed them to stay. The country was urbanizing, indoor plumbing was spreading from a luxury into an expectation, and a company that made good enameled tubs and sinks and toilets was positioned to grow enormously. And Walter, who wanted the company to grow, faced the problem that every industrialist of that era faced, which was labor. He needed workers, a lot of them, mostly immigrants, and he needed them to stay, because a factory with high turnover is a factory that is always training new people and never getting good. The standard solution in American industry was brutal and it was everywhere. You paid workers as little as you could, you housed them in whatever squalor grew up around the plant, and when they wore out you replaced them. because there was always another boat full of immigrants. That was the model in the steel towns and the mill towns and the mining camps, and it produced the grim, grey, exploited company towns that most people picture when they hear the phrase. Walter Kohler looked at that model and rejected it, and it is important to understand that he rejected it for reasons that were partly moral and partly practical, and that he himself probably could not have separated. The moral part was real. His father had been an immigrant. The family knew, in their bones, what it was to arrive in America with nothing and be treated as disposable, and there was a genuine conviction, running through the whole Kohler clan, that this was wrong, that a worker was a human being and deserved better. Walter had a phrase he used, and it became the motto of the whole enterprise. A worker, he said, deserves not only wages but roses as well. Wages and roses, bread and beauty. It is a lovely idea, and he meant it, and the practical part was just as real, and it pointed in the same direction. A worker who has roses does not leave. A worker who lives in a beautiful house he is slowly buying, in a lovely town with his children in a good school and a garden out back, is a worker who stays and who works hard, and who does not make trouble because he has too much to lose. Contentment is the cheapest possible way to prevent turnover, and to prevent unions, and to prevent all the friction that costs a factory money. The moral reason and the practical reason gave the same answer, and Walter Kohler could not tell them apart, and that inability is the seed of everything that happens later. He truly wanted to be good to his workers. He also wanted to control them, and because being good to them and controlling them turned out to be the same set of actions, he never had to choose, and he never had to notice that he had not chosen. So he decided to build a town, not a slum at the factory gate, a model town, the most beautiful company town in America. And to build it, he did something that tells you just how seriously he took it. He hired the best. In 1899, the Kohler Company had moved its plant out of Sheboygan, 4 miles inland to open farmland along the Sheboygan River. A little settlement had grown up there, platted by a local farmer called Riverside. And around 1913, Walter Kohler decided to turn that settlement into a planned community, and he went and hired the most famous name in American landscape design. He hired the Olmsted firm. The Olmsted name belonged to Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had designed Central Park in New York, the founder of American landscape architecture, the person more responsible than anyone for the idea that a designed landscape could shape how people lived. Olmsted himself had died in 1903, but his firm carried on, run by his sons and successors as the Olmsted brothers, and it was the most prestigious design firm in the country. That is who Walter Kohler brought to a farm field in Wisconsin to lay out housing for his factory workers. Think about the gap that represents. The men who designed Central Park, the great democratic pleasure ground of New York, were now designing the streets that immigrant tub makers would live on in rural Wisconsin. That is not what you do if you see your workers as disposable. That is what you do if you truly believe they deserve roses. The Olmsted brothers drew up a 50-year master plan. 50 years! A half-century vision for a village of factory workers. They gave it meandering, curving streets that met at gentle angles. An Olmsted signature meant to slow you down and make the town feel like a place rather than a grid. They planned parks and green spaces and natural landscaping. Walter, for his part, is said to have toured the model industrial villages of Europe before building the famous garden cities the English soap and chocolate manufacturers had built for their own workers, taking notes on how to do benevolence properly. Those European models are worth knowing, because Kohler is part of an international family of experiments, and they all share the same beautiful flaw. In England, the soap magnate William Lever had built Port Sunlight, a gorgeous model village for the workers at his soap works, with fine houses and gardens and art galleries and schools. The Cadbury chocolate family had built Bourneville, another lovely worker village, dry, wholesome, planted with trees. These places were the pride of enlightened capitalism, held up around the world as proof that industry did not have to mean squalor, that a manufacturer could house his workers in beauty. And every one of them ran on the same logic as Kohler and hit the same wall. The benevolent employer builds a beautiful town and controls it completely, and the workers live better than they could anywhere else, and are in exchange more thoroughly dependent on and controlled by their employer than workers anywhere else. The Garden City was a genuine gift and a genuine cage at the same time, everywhere it was tried, and Kohler was simply the American version, built by a family that had seen the European originals and admired them and reproduced their beauty and their trap together, because the two could not be separated. You could not have the roses without the ownership, because the ownership was how the roses got paid for and kept perfect. And what they built was, by common agreement, one of the loveliest company towns that has ever existed. Handsome brick houses, English cottages and colonial revival homes and craftsman bungalows, an eclectic, charming human variety rather than rows of identical boxes, gardens, a good school, and presiding over all of it, opened in 1918 the American Club, the Tudor palace where the single immigrant men lived while they saved up and learned English and became citizens and eventually moved out into houses of their own in the beautiful town. A visitor from that era, and there were many because the town became famous, would have seen something that looked like a small miracle. Working men, immigrants, living not in squalor but in beauty, their children in a fine school, their evenings in a handsome club, their futures apparently secure. Time magazine would later call it, without irony, possibly the world's most attractive company town. To live there was, by the standard of an American factory worker in 1925, close to wonderful, and it is worth picturing because the comfort is the whole point of the trap. You worked in a clean, well-run plant for wages that were above average for the industry. You came home not to a tenement but to a solid brick house on a curving, tree-lined street, a house you were buying with a garden where you could grow vegetables and roses. Your children walked to a school that was as good as any in the state, better than most, funded generously by the company. In the evening you might go to the American Club, even after you had moved out of it, for a beer and a game at the bowling alley. On Sundays you walked in a town that had been laid out by the designers of Central Park, past parks and green spaces and handsome buildings, and you could feel, with justice, that you had made it, that you had given your family a life in America better than anything your parents in the old country could have dreamed. Compare that to the alternative, the ordinary lot of the immigrant industrial worker of that era, the tenement, the filth, the danger, the contempt, and you understand why so many Kohler workers were sincerely grateful, and why so many of them, decades later, still defended the family and the town with real warmth. They were not brainwashed. They were correctly perceiving that they had been treated far better than their peers elsewhere. The gratitude was earned. It was all real. That is the thing to hold on to. None of it was fake. The houses were truly good. The school was excellent. The English classes helped. The town was beautiful. The kindness was not a mask over cruelty. The kindness was the actual sincere product of a family that believed in it. And every bit of it belonged to the Kohlers. This is the part that the beauty is designed to make you not notice, and it is the whole point. In Kohler, Wisconsin, the family owned the factory, obviously. But they also owned the land the town sat on. They owned or controlled the financing of the houses the workers lived in. They controlled the water and the utilities. They controlled the design of every building through a residential review board and a set of formal aesthetic standards that dictated what your house could look like, so that the town would stay beautiful, which meant that you could not paint your own house the wrong colour or build the wrong kind of porch on the home you were supposedly buying. This is worth dwelling on, because it is the trap made visible in the smallest possible detail. A man buys a house. In America, the house is the great symbol of independence, the thing that is yours, where you can do as you please, paint the door red, build a shed, plant what you like because it is your own. That is what owning a home is supposed to mean. In Kohler, you could buy the house and still not do those things because the town's beauty, which was the family's beauty, took precedence over your preference. The review board would tell you no. Your house was yours to pay for and not quite yours to control. And notice that the rule was, on its face, entirely reasonable and even benevolent. Nobody wants their lovely town wrecked by one neighbour's hideous purple addition. The aesthetic standards truly kept Kohler beautiful, and the beauty benefited everyone who lived there, including you. That is the pattern once more. The control was real, and the control was good for you, and the control was not yours to opt out of, all at the same time so that you could not even resent it cleanly, because the thing constraining you was also protecting your property values and your morning walk. Even the smallest freedom, the colour of your own front door, was a rose the family handed you or withheld, and you were supposed to be grateful either way. They funded the school, paying at one point around 85% of the teachers' salaries through the tax base, which meant, as one teacher put it decades later with uncomfortable honesty, that the teachers felt a certain loyalty to the company, whether or not the company told them to. And beyond the town, the family owned the government. not metaphorically. Walter Kohler became the governor of Wisconsin, and later his son, Walter Kohler Jr., also became the governor of Wisconsin. Two governors from one plumbing family running the state. When you worked at Kohler and lived in a Kohler house, on Kohler land, drinking Kohler water, with your kids in a Kohler-funded school, your employer was also your landlord, was also your city planner, was also, quite literally, your governor. There was no part of your life the family did not touch, and every single one of those touches was, on its face, benevolent. The house was a good house, the water was clean water, the school was a good school, the governor built good roads, it was all roses, and it was all theirs. Now, this is the trap, and it repays attention being very precise about it, because it is subtle, and it is the reason this town was so much harder to escape than a cruel one would have been. There is a useful comparison here to the most famous company town of all, Pullman, outside Chicago, built by the railroad car magnate George Pullman a generation earlier. Pullman built a model town too, and it also ended in a historic, violent strike in 1894. But Pullman was different from Kohler in a way that clarifies what the Kohlers actually were. George Pullman justified his town in plain, cold business terms. A happy, healthy worker, he said, is an efficient and productive worker. He built the town as an investment, expected it to turn a profit, charged his workers rent calculated to give him a return, and made no pretense that it was anything but a business proposition. When the Depression came and he cut wages but not rents, the pure commercial logic of the thing was exposed and the town exploded. The Kohlers were softer and more sincere than that, and it made them harder to fight, not easier. They did not talk about efficiency, they talked about roses. Their paternalism was warmer, more sincerely felt, more wrapped in real affection and real conviction. Where Pullman said, in effect, "I house you well because it is good business," the Kohlers said, "We house you well because we care about you," and they meant it. And a worker can rise up against a landlord who admits he is only in it for the money far more easily than against a benefactor who seems truly to love him. Pullman's coldness gave his workers permission to hate him. The Kohlers' warmth took that permission away, which is why it took them 20 years longer and a strike 3 times as long to break the Kohler arrangement than it took to break Pullman's. A cruel company town is easy to leave, morally. If your boss beats you and cheats you and houses you in filth, then hating him is simple, and organizing against him is simple, and there is no confusion in your heart about whether you're in the right. Cruelty clarifies. It gives you a clean enemy. Kindness does the opposite. Kindness entangles. When the man who owns your house and your water and your job and your state has also truly been good to you, has given your family a beautiful life you could not have had anywhere else, then to organize against him feels like betrayal. It feels like ingratitude. He gave you roses, and now you want to fight him? Over what? You have a lovely house. Your children are in a wonderful school. What kind of person bites a hand that has only ever fed him? That feeling, that guilt, that sense that resistance would be a kind of treachery against a benefactor is worth more to an owner than any number of guards. It is the cheapest and strongest lock ever invented, and the Kohlers built it not by scheming but simply by being who they were, generous and controlling in one inseparable motion. The workers were not held by chains, they were held by gratitude and by the very real fear of losing a very real good thing, and by the terrible difficulty of explaining even to themselves what just was wrong with a place where everything was so nice. Because something was wrong, and the workers could feel it, even when they could not name it, and it was this. In all that generosity there was one thing the family had never given them, and would never give them, and it was the only thing that actually mattered. The right to say no. You could have the house, but not on your own terms. You could have the school, but you did not run it. You could have the beautiful town, but you could not change it, or govern it, or leave the arrangement while staying in your home, because the arrangement and the home were the same thing. You could have every rose the family chose to give you, and you could have only as much say in your own life as the family chose to allow, which was none, because a gift is not a right, and everything in Kohler was a gift. A gift can be withdrawn. That is what makes it a gift and not a right. And a person living entirely on gifts, however generous, is living entirely at the pleasure of the giver, and some part of them always knows it, and that knowledge sits under even the most comfortable life like a splinter you cannot find. The workers of Kohler were given everything a human being could want, except the power to want something different. And it turned out, as it always turns out, that the power to want something different is the one thing people will eventually fight and bleed and strike for years to get. even when, especially when, they already have everything else. And in the summer of 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, the splinter finally worked its way to the surface, and the most beautiful company town in America turned, for 11 days, into a battlefield. It was not, in fact, the first time Kohler workers had pushed back, though the earlier attempt is nearly forgotten. Back in 1897, decades before the model town was even built, when the company was still down in Sheboygan and cutting wages in hard times, the workers had struck, and that early strike had drawn in two of the giants of American socialism, Eugene Debs, the great Labour leader and future presidential candidate, and Victor Berger, who would become one of the first socialists elected to Congress. Even then, the biggest names in the American left had turned up at Kohler's gate. That 1897 strike failed, and the company went on to build its beautiful town, and for a generation the beauty did its work and there was peace. But it is worth knowing that the fight was older than the town, that there had been friction between this family and its workers almost from the beginning, and that the roses were in part an answer to that friction, a way of buying with beauty the peace that force alone had not secured. The Garden City was not only an act of love, it was also, in a sense, a very sophisticated response to a labour problem the family had already had once and did not want again. The Depression is what cracked it, because the Depression did something the good times had hidden. It made the family's generosity conditional in a way everyone could suddenly see. When times were good, the arrangement felt like pure gift. The company was making money, the workers had their houses and their roses, and the fact that all of it flowed from the family's goodwill was easy to forget, because the goodwill was flowing freely. But when the Depression hit and profits collapsed, the company cut hours and cut pay, and suddenly the workers were earning far less, while the deductions for their houses and their rent kept coming out of those shrinking paychecks. The roses were still there, but now you were paying for them out of a wage that could no longer cover them, and you had no say in any of it, and the gift began to feel like what it had always partly been, which was a bill. And there was a new idea moving through American industry in 1934, carried on the New Deal, and the idea was that workers had a right, an actual legal right, to organize a union of their own choosing and bargain collectively. Not a union the company set up for them, their own. Because the Kohlers, like many paternalistic employers, had set one up for them. In 1933, the company had created something called the Kohler Workers Association, a company union, an organization that looked like a union and let workers feel represented, but that was, in the end, another gift from the family, another thing the company controlled. It was the whole Kohler philosophy in miniature. Here, we have made you a union. Is it not a lovely union? Now you do not need to make your own. And in June of 1934, a group of Kohler workers decided they did need to make their own. They organized under the American Federation of Labor, and they demanded that the company recognize their independent union instead of the company one. They wanted the real thing, chosen by them, answerable to them, capable of saying no to the family. Walter Kohler refused, and here you see the benevolent father meet the limit of his benevolence, and it is a revealing limit. Walter was willing to give his workers almost anything. Houses, schools, gardens, a beautiful town, roses. What he was not willing to give them was independence from him, because independence was the one gift that would end his ability to give the others on his terms, and to a man who could not separate generosity from control, being asked to give up control felt like being asked to stop being generous. He experienced the union demand not as workers seeking their rights, but as children turning on a loving father, and he responded the way such a father does when defied. He decided to show them who was in charge. He shut the plant. Not for the usual few days around the 4th of July, but indefinitely, with no reopening date, the workers told they would be called back as necessary. It was a lockout dressed as a pause, a demonstration of just where the power lay. And then, when the workers struck in response, declaring a general strike on the 16th of July, he brought in force. The company hired special deputies, hundreds of them, armed. The village was closed to traffic. Crowds gathered, the beautiful town filled with guns. For 11 days it held in tension, ugly but not yet lethal. And then, on the 27th of July 1934, it broke. The trigger, as these things often are, was small and almost administrative. The strikers had turned back a coal car trying to enter the plant, and the special deputies moved to break through the picket line to escort it in. In the confusion that followed, With breaking glass and tear gas and blank cartridges, and it turned out real bullets, the deputies fired into the crowd. 2 men were killed. Their names were Lee Wakefield, who was 25, and Henry Engelman, who was 27, though you will find the spelling of Engelman's name vary from source to source, and in 1 or 2 places you will even find different names entirely, which is its own small, sad fact that the record cannot fully agree on who just died that night in the most beautiful company town in America. What is not in dispute is that 2 men were shot dead, and that about 47 more, men, women and boys, were wounded or gassed or injured. And there is a detail about Lee Wakefield that makes it worse. According to his family, he did not even work at Kohler. He worked at a shoe company. He was, they said, an innocent spectator, a young man who had come to watch and who caught a rifle bullet through the chest. 2 days later, at the request of the governor and the sheriff, some 250 National Guard troops arrived to restore order, and the strike, having produced 2 corpses and 47 wounded, wound down toward a settlement that was, in the end, mostly on the company's terms. The independent union did not win recognition. Most of the workers went back, and most accepted the company union, the Kohler Workers Association, the family's version of a union, and the partisans of the real one kept picketing quietly, without much hope, all the way until 1941. So the first revolt failed. The father won. The gift, with all its guns, held. But something had changed that could not change back, and it was this. The workers had seen the limit. For all the roses, for all the beauty, they had watched the family's benevolence end at the point where their independence began, and they had watched it end in gunfire, and 2 of them were dead. You cannot unsee that. The town was just as beautiful the day after as the day before, but everyone in it now knew precisely where the roses stopped and the guns started, and that knowledge sat in the town for 20 years, waiting. To understand why the family behaved as it did, it helps to see how deeply they had woven their own history and sentiment into the town, because it was never, to them, a mere business asset. It was an extension of the family itself. Consider a small building on the edge of the village called the Welde House, the house in the woods, built in 1931. It was commissioned by Marie Christine Kohler, and it was a careful recreation of the Austrian childhood home of her father, John Michael Kohler, the founder, the boy who had come to America at 10. She built it, of all things, as a meeting place for Girl Scouts. Think about what that means. The family took the founder's humble Alpine origins, the immigrant boy's cottage, and lovingly rebuilt it in Wisconsin as a gift to the community's children. That is not the act of a family that sees a town as a spreadsheet. That is the act of a family that experiences the town as its own extended household, a place saturated with family memory and family sentiment, where the founder's boyhood home becomes a clubhouse for the local girls. And that is precisely why they could not let go. You do not negotiate at arm's length with your own household. You do not let a union tell you how to run your own family's home. The very depth of the family's emotional investment in the town, the thing that made it beautiful and personal and kind, was the same thing that made it impossible for them to treat the workers as free adults with independent rights, because free adults with independent rights are not what you have in a household. What you have in a household is children, whom you love and provide for and expect to obey. The 20 years between the 2 strikes are, in their way, the most interesting part of the story, because on the surface almost nothing happened, and underneath, everything did. On the surface, Kohler in the 1940s looked like a triumph of the family's philosophy. The independent union had been beaten. The company union, the Kohler Workers Association, represented the workers, or appeared to. The town was beautiful. The Second World War brought enormous demand and full employment. A worker could support a whole family on 1 Kohler wage, own a good house in a lovely town and send his kids to a fine school, and many of them were truly grateful and said so for the rest of their lives. If you had asked the family in 1948 whether their system worked, they would have pointed around them at the roses and said, obviously. But the company union was the flaw, because a company union is a contradiction that cannot hold forever. Its entire purpose is to give workers the feeling of representation without the substance, and feelings, unlike substance, wear off. Year after year, the Kohler Workers Association sat across the table from the company and discovered, again and again, that it could ask but it could not insist, that it could request but it could not refuse, because it had no independent power, no strike fund, no outside support, nothing behind it but the goodwill of the very family it was supposed to be bargaining with. It was a union that could not say no, which is to say, it was not a union at all. It was one more rose. And slowly through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the workers who ran that company union came to understand that they had been given a toy, and they began to want a real one. The decisive step came in 1952. The Kohler Workers' Association, the tame company union the family had created, voted to affiliate with the United Auto Workers, one of the largest, toughest, best-funded independent unions in the country, led by Walter Reuther, one of the towering figures of American labor. The company's own union had defected. The toy had grown up and gone looking for real power, and it had found it in the form of the UAW, and it became UAW Local 833. Now the workers had for the first time something behind them that the family did not control, a national union with money, with lawyers, with a strike fund, with the ability to organize a boycott across the entire country. For the first time since John Michael Kohler coated that horse trough, there was a force inside Kohler that could actually say no to the family and mean it. And the family, now led on the company side by Walter Sr.'s brother Herbert Kohler, could not accept it. Of course they could not. Accepting it would have meant accepting that the workers had a right to something the family had not granted them, and that was the one thing this family had never been able to do across 3 generations. To Herbert Kohler, as to his brother before him, an independent union was not a legitimate expression of workers' rights. It was ingratitude in organized form. It was the children, to whom the family had given everything, turning on the father and inviting a stranger into the house. Negotiations for a new contract began in early 1954 and broke down over wages, over pensions, over seniority, over arbitration, over the union's security, over all the ordinary things, but underneath all of them, over the single real question that had been the real question since 1934, which was whether the workers or the family would have the final say. If you have come with me this far, into the strange trap of a town too kind to leave, and through the failed revolt of 1934, you are just the kind of person this channel is built for, and subscribing keeps the long ones coming. Because on the 5th of April, 1954, after working for weeks without a contract, UAW Local 833 went out on strike. Some 2,800 of the plant's roughly 3,300 workers walked out. On the first day, around 3,000 of them marched 3 deep around the entire plant. Nobody, on either side, imagined what they were starting, because that strike, begun on a spring day in 1954, would become the longest major strike in the history of the United States. It would last on the picket line for years. It would drag through the courts for years after that. It would not be fully resolved until the middle of the 1960s, more than a decade after it began, and it would break, at last and for good, the arrangement that John Michael Kohler and his sons had built, the beautiful, benevolent, total control of a family over a town. Herbert Kohler did what his brother had done 20 years earlier, only harder and with more patience, because he had learned from 1934 that force applied all at once produces corpses and headlines and sympathy for the strikers. Herbert applied force slowly. He shut the plant for the first 2 months, hoping, perhaps, that hunger would do the work for him and the strikers would drift back. When they did not, he made the decision that defined the next decade. He reopened it with replacement workers. This was a calculated and, in its way, brilliant move, and it is worth understanding why it was so much more effective than his brother's guns had been in 1934. Guns create martyrs. A dead striker is a rallying point, a photograph, a name on a banner, a reason for the whole labour movement and half the public to side with the union. Herbert had watched that happen in 1934 and had learned from it. Replacement workers create something else entirely. They do not create martyrs, they create a functioning factory. Every day the plant ran with other men doing the strikers' jobs was a day that proved the strikers were not needed, that the company could go on without them, that their great sacrifice was, so far, accomplishing nothing except keeping them off a paycheck while strangers earned it. It was psychological warfare of the most grinding kind. And it was legal, or legal enough, and it put the burden of endurance entirely on the strikers, who now had to hold out not against a dramatic act of violence, but against the slow, daily, demoralizing spectacle of their own replaceability. Most strikes are won or lost on just this question, whether the company can run without the workers, and Herbert Kohler was betting that it could, and for a long time it looked like he was right. Non-union labour brought in to do the strikers' jobs while the strikers stood on the picket line watching other men walk through the gate to the work that had been theirs. There is almost nothing in the world of labour that generates more rage than the sight of a replacement worker crossing your picket line, and Kohler now had that rage concentrated day after day for years. What followed was 6 years of grinding, sporadic, ugly conflict. Not a single explosion like 1934, but a long, low, bitter war of attrition. There was violence, on both sides and around the edges, vandalism. The company would eventually charge its opponents with more than 1,000 separate acts of it, and over 300 people were arrested at various points. The beautiful town became a place where neighbours who had lived side by side for decades no longer spoke, where a man who crossed the line and a man who held it might be brothers, where the roses kept blooming on lawns that now had picket lines running past them. The strike did not just divide the workers from the company, it cut through the town itself and through families, and it left scars in Sheboygan County that people would still be talking about half a century later. This is the part that gets lost in the legal history, and it is the part that mattered most to the people who lived it. A strike this long does not stay an abstraction about wages and recognition. It becomes personal, and then it becomes permanent. When a man crosses the picket line to keep feeding his children, and the man on the line is his neighbour or his brother-in-law or the friend he grew up with, something breaks between them that does not heal. For years in a small town they pass each other on those beautiful curving Olmsted streets, and they do not speak. Their wives stop speaking. Their children are told which families are not to be visited. The word scab enters the town and never fully leaves it. People who lived through it described a community physically intact and socially shattered. The houses were as lovely as ever. The lawns were still cut like a golf course, and underneath, the town was at war with itself, family against family, decade after decade, over a fight that most of them had not started and could not end. Some of those divisions outlasted the strike by 50 years. Some outlasted the people who started them, passed down to children who inherited a grudge without quite remembering its origin. That is the true cost of the thing, not in the $12 million the union spent or the profits the company lost, but in a small, beautiful town that spent a generation unable to look itself in the eye. The union did not fight it alone, and this is what made 1954 different from 1934. In 1934, the workers had been on their own, a local, isolated, easily surrounded. In 1954, they had the United Auto Workers behind them, and the UAW brought two weapons the family had never faced before. The first was money. The UAW funded the strike, pouring in something like $12 million over its length, keeping strikers fed, paying for medical care, giving them, at least in the early years, a small weekly allowance the strikers called jingling money, enough to keep going, enough to make it possible to stay out not for days or weeks, but for years. A company can outlast hungry workers. It is much harder to outlast workers who are being fed by a national union with deep pockets. But money alone does not keep people on a picket line for years, and the human side of that endurance is its own kind of astonishing. These were men with families, mortgages, children who needed shoes, and they stood on that line in Wisconsin winters, year after year, watching other men take their jobs on a small weekly allowance and their own stubbornness. Many could not do it. Some had to leave town entirely and find work elsewhere, breaking up families and communities that had been in Sheboygan County for generations. Those who stayed developed the fierce, weary solidarity of people who have already given up too much to quit, who keep going in part because stopping would mean that all the years of sacrifice had brought nothing. The union worked hard to keep that spirit alive. Local leaders spoke to the press constantly, put out a daily bulletin so that every striker felt informed and involved rather than forgotten, staged imaginative public events to keep the cause visible and the members engaged. They understood that a long strike is finally a test of morale more than of money, that the danger was not just running out of funds but running out of hope, and they fought the loss of hope as deliberately as they fought the company. It is one of the reasons the strike lasted as long as it did. The workers had been given, by the UAW, something the company union had never given them, which was the experience of belonging to something that was truly their own, and people will endure almost anything for that. The second weapon was the boycott. The UAW organised a nationwide campaign to stop the buying of Kohler products, and it aimed it with precision at the plumbing trade. Plumbers, contractors, building trades, municipal purchasers across the country, from Boston to Los Angeles, were pressed to refuse Kohler fixtures, to specify other brands, to leave Kohler tubs and toilets out of their buildings. It was technically constrained by law. The Taft-Hartley Act had recently restricted this kind of secondary boycott, but the plumbing unions found ways to apply pressure anyway, and for a company whose whole business was selling fixtures to the building trades, having the building trades turn against you was a serious wound. The legal background there matters, because it shows how much the ground had shifted under the family's feet since 1934. In 1935, the New Deal had passed the Wagner Act, which for the first time gave American workers a strong federally protected right to organize and bargain, and created the National Labor Relations Board to enforce it. That was the law that made the whole 1954 fight possible, that gave the workers a weapon their fathers in 1934 had not had. But in 1947, the pendulum had swung back, and Congress had passed the Taft-Hartley Act over a presidential veto, rolling back some of Labor's power, and one of the things it restricted was just the kind of solidarity boycott the UAW now wanted to run against Kohler, the secondary boycott, where one union pressures companies that are not even party to the dispute. So the UAW had to be clever, working through the plumbing trades to discourage the use of Kohler products without technically violating the law. It was a chess game played across the whole national economy, and it is a measure of how far the fight had come from a picket line in Wisconsin that it now turned on the fine print of federal labor statutes and the strategies for working around them. And then the fight went to Washington, and it became national theatre. In 1958, the United States Senate held hearings on the Kohler dispute as part of a famous investigation into labor and management corruption, the McClellan Committee. And the cast of that committee is a startling reminder of how large this fight had become. The chief counsel questioning witnesses was a young lawyer named Robert F. Kennedy. His brother, Senator John F. Kennedy, sat on the committee. Another member was Barry Goldwater, who would become the great conservative champion and a fierce antagonist of the unions. And testifying, defending the strike, was Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, one of the most powerful men in American labor. The little plumbing town in Wisconsin had put the future author of The New Frontier, a future Republican presidential nominee, and the titan of the auto workers in the same room, arguing about whether a family had the right to run a town. The committee, characteristically, reached no unified conclusion. It split along the same lines the country did, with the union's defenders seeing a family crushing its workers and the union's critics seeing organized labor's violence and coercion. Both sides found what they came to find. But the point was not the verdict. The point was the venue. A dispute that had started as a local matter, a family and its workers in one small Wisconsin village, had climbed all the way to the Senate of the United States and was being argued over by the men who would shape the next 2 decades of American life. The Kennedys were building the national reputations that would carry one of them to the White House. Goldwater was forging the conservative movement that would remake the Republican Party. Reuther was at the height of his power as the conscience of American labor, and they were spending their time on Kohler, on plumbing fixtures, on a family in Sheboygan County, because the Kohler fight had become a proxy for the largest question in mid-century America, which was where the line falls between the rights of an owner and the rights of the people who work for him. The family had lost control of its own story. It was no longer a Kohler matter. It was a national one, and the family could not call it home. And here, in the middle of the largest labor fight in the country, comes the detail that tells you this was, at bottom, a family story, and always had been. Remember that the Kohlers had produced 2 governors of Wisconsin. The second, Walter Kohler Jr., was actually sitting as governor during part of the 1954 strike. He was Herbert Kohler's nephew. And at one point, the governor of Wisconsin, a member of the Kohler family, publicly appealed to Herbert Kohler to settle the strike, to find a compromise, to end the thing that was tearing the state's most famous town apart. Herbert Kohler sharply, publicly rejected his own nephew. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole thing in a single gesture. The family that ran the town and the state could not settle a strike even with itself. The governor of Wisconsin, a Kohler, asked the company, a Kohler, to make peace, and the company told the governor no. If you ever wanted proof that this was never really about business, that it was about a family's absolute need to not be told what to do, even by its own, there it is. Herbert Kohler would not yield to the unions, would not yield to the boycott, would not yield to the Senate of the United States, and would not yield to the governor of Wisconsin, because the governor of Wisconsin in the end was just another younger Kohler presuming to tell the head of the family how to run what was his. He would rather fight the entire American labor movement to a standstill for a decade than admit that anyone, even his own blood, had the standing to tell him to let go. In the end, it was not the boycott, and it was not the Senate that beat him. It was the law. Through all of this, the union had been pursuing a case through the National Labour Relations Board, the federal body created by the New Deal to enforce workers' right to organise. And the case turned on a specific, technical, decisive question. Had the Kohler company bargained in good faith as the law required, or had it only pretended to bargain while actually setting out to break the union? In 1960, the Labour Relations Board delivered its answer, and it was against Kohler. The board found that the company had refused to bargain in good faith. It found, among other things, that Kohler had done things like cut the workers' hours from a normal week of around 48 hours, with overtime down to 32, in ways that were not honest dealing but pressure, and it ordered the company to reinstate around 1,700 strikers and to pay them back pay for what they had lost. Herbert Kohler appealed, because of course he did, and he lost the appeal. And so, after years on the picket line and years more in the courts, the strike finally wound down. The pickets came off around 1960 and 1961. The full resolution, the back pay, the final settlement, dragged on into the middle of the 1960s, more than a decade after that spring morning in 1954. The exact date the thing ended depends on which document you count, which is fitting for a dispute this long and this bitter, but by any measure it was the longest major strike in the history of the United States, and the workers, in the end, won. Or did they? Because this is where the story refuses to become the clean labour triumph it looks like it wants to be, and the honest version has to sit with the ambiguity. It is worth being explicit that there are two serious opposed accounts of this strike, and honest people have believed both. On one side stands the work of Walter Uphoff, who documented the strike across 2 books and 30 years, and whose sympathies, though he tried for fairness, were clearly with the strikers. In his telling, this is a story of a proud, controlling family crushing its workers' basic rights, breaking a legitimate strike with replacements and violence, and endless legal manoeuvring, and finally being caught and condemned by the federal government for bargaining in bad faith. The heroes are the workers who held the line for a decade against overwhelming power. On the other side stands the work of Sylvester Petro, who told the company's side and who saw something very different. A responsible, generous employer beset by an aggressive outside union that used mass picketing, intimidation, violence against non-strikers, and a nationwide boycott to try to force compulsory unionism on workers who had been treated well for generations. In this telling, the villain is the UAW, the government's ruling is biased and unjust, and the real victims are the workers who wanted to keep working, and the family that had done right by its people, only to be punished for defending itself. I'm not going to pretend these two accounts weigh equally, and the federal government, after examining the evidence, ruled for the union and against the company. But an honest history has to acknowledge that both accounts describe real things. There was real company benevolence, and there was real union coercion, and there was real corporate ruthlessness, and there was real worker courage, all in the same long, ugly human fight. Anyone who tells you Kohler is a simple story of good and evil is selling you one of the 2 books and hiding the other. The truth is that it was a tragedy in the old sense, a collision not of good against evil, but of 2 goods, the family's real love for its creation and the workers' real right to their own lives, that could not both be satisfied, and that therefore had to be settled the hard way, over a decade, at the cost of everything it cost. The union won the legal case. The workers got reinstatement and back pay. The independent union was, at last, real, and the family's total control was, at last, broken. In the deep sense that this whole video has been about, the workers got the one thing they had been denied for 80 years, the ability to say no. That is a real victory and it should not be minimized. But the company was hardly destroyed. When it was all over, Time magazine surveyed the wreckage and reached a deflating conclusion. The boycott into which the UAW had poured all that money had been only partially successful, and Kohler, despite the longest strike in American history, despite the Senate hearings and the national campaign and the federal ruling against it, was still, the magazine noted, a leader in its industry. The company had taken a decade of the hardest blows the American labor movement could throw, and it was still standing, still making tubs, still dominating the market, still owned by the family, still sitting in its beautiful town. It is worth marking what the long fight changed beyond Kohler itself, because a struggle that consumes a decade of the nation's attention leaves marks everywhere. The 1960 ruling against Kohler, upheld on appeal, became a significant precedent in the law of what it means for an employer to bargain in good faith. It helped establish that an employer could not simply go through the motions of negotiation, while secretly aiming to destroy the union, that the duty to bargain had real content the government would enforce. Workers in other industries, in other towns, benefited from a line drawn in Sheboygan, and the tactics on both sides became part of the permanent playbook of American labor conflict. The company's strategy of shutting down, reopening with replacements, and outlasting the strike through sheer endurance became a model that anti-union employers would study and reuse for generations. So did the union's strategy of the national boycott and the media campaign. Both sides, in losing and winning, taught the rest of the country how this kind of war is fought. Kohler was a laboratory, and the whole nation took notes. So who won? The workers won their rights, and the family kept its company and its town and its fortune. Both of those are true. It was a victory for labor that changed the law and the lives of the workers, and it was, at the same time, a demonstration that even the total mobilization of American labor could not actually break a determined family that owned enough. Herbert Kohler lost the legal case and kept everything that mattered to him, except the one thing he had refused to share, which was the final say. And even that he lost only to the federal government, never to the workers directly, and never with anything resembling grace. The family is still there, by the way. Kohler is still privately held, still run by the Kohler family, still one of the great plumbing companies of the world, now with golf resorts and generators and an empire that stretches across continents. The family fortune has been estimated in the billions. The town of Kohler is still immaculate, its lawns still cut like a golf course, and the company still shapes it. There were more strikes in 1983 and in 2015. The relationship between the family and the workers it depends on has never fully stopped being contested, because the underlying question, who really controls a person's working life, never fully goes away. The modern chapters are quieter than the old ones, but they rhyme. In recent decades, the company introduced a two-tier wage structure, in which newer and temporary workers do the same jobs as veterans for substantially lower pay and fewer benefits. It was a way of holding down labour costs without cutting the wages of the existing workforce, a division of the workers into a better-paid old guard and a worse-paid new class, and it was effective enough that other large Wisconsin employers copied it almost immediately. The union in the area is a fraction of the size it once was, and yet the town endures, and much of the old bargain endures with it. People who have worked at Kohler for decades will tell you, with real feeling, that the company is a good place, that being family-owned and privately held has kept the work in Wisconsin when a public company would have shipped it overseas long ago, that the family, for all of it, has been a better steward than the faceless corporations that dominate American manufacturing. They may well be right. That is the enduring complication of Kohler. The paternalism that trapped the workers also, in some real way, protected them. And 100 years on, the descendants of the men who struck are still weighing, as their grandfathers did, whether the roses were worth the price. And the American Club, the Tudor dormitory where the immigrant men once lived for $27.50 a month and learned to be Americans, is now, as we began, a 5-star luxury resort. The transformation was not an accident of history. It was a decision made by the family in the later 20th century as the old dormitory outlived its purpose and the company reinvented itself around golf and hospitality and luxury. The same instinct that had built the beautiful town and the immigrant dormitory in the first place, the Kohler instinct for taking rough material and making it refined and beautiful and profitable, was simply applied one more time to the dormitory itself. The building that had once refined immigrants was now refined into a resort, and the family, characteristically, did it with real care and real taste, preserving the history, honouring the workers, making something truly beautiful and selling it at a very high price. Roses, once again, and ownership once again, in the same inseparable act, 100 years on. And that is where the whole story comes to rest, in that building, because the American Club today is the perfect and final expression of everything Kohler ever was. Consider what it is now. The rooms where immigrant labourers slept 2 and 3 to a space, saving their wages, learning their English, are now luxury suites renting to the wealthy for hundreds of dollars a night, each one named after a famous American, so that a guest can sleep in a room called Abraham Lincoln or Mark Twain, and feel, gently, patriotic. The tavern where exhausted tub makers drank their beer after a foundry shift is a charming period pub for the guests, and the actual history of the actual workers, their photographs, their citizenship papers, the record of their real lives, has been gathered into a corridor the hotel calls the Hall of Immigrants, a tasteful, moving little exhibit that the guests stroll through on the way to the spa. Look at what has happened there, because it is the mechanism completing itself one last time. The building was originally a gift. Walter Kohler built it out of genuine generosity to give lonely immigrant men a decent, beautiful place to live while they became Americans. It was one of the kindest things the family ever did, and it was also, like everything in Kohler, an instrument of control, a place where the workers lived under the company's roof and ate the company's food and learned the company's idea of what an American should be, entirely dependent on the family's goodwill. And now, a century later, the same building performs the same double act one final time, except the workers are gone and only the memory of them remains, and even the memory has been turned into a product. The immigrant story, the real hardship and hope of real men, is now an amenity. It is something the hotel sells, a bit of authentic history to enrich a luxury stay, a way of making $600 a night feel meaningful. The workers who were once made into Americans in that building are now, in that same building, made into decor for the enjoyment of the rich. The gift became the control, became the commodity. The trough became the bathtub, became the museum piece. It is the most Kohler thing imaginable, and the guests browsing the Hall of Immigrants on their way to dinner have no more idea what they are participating in than the guests ever do. And it clarifies the one distinction that this whole long story turns on, the distinction between a gift and a right, which sounds like a small philosophical point, and is in fact the difference between dependence and freedom. A gift comes from the giver's will. It is an expression of the giver's goodness, and it remains always in the giver's control. However generous, however reliable, it is given because the giver chooses to give it, and what one person chooses to give, that person can choose to withhold. To live on gifts is to live inside someone else's continuing decision to be kind. It can be a very comfortable place to live. It is not a free one. A right is the opposite. A right does not come from anyone's goodness. You do not have to be grateful for it. You do not have to earn it, and crucially, no one can withdraw it because they are displeased with you. A right is yours whether or not the powerful feel like honouring it, which is why the powerful so rarely want to grant one, and so often prefer to be generous instead. Generosity keeps the power, rights give it away. The entire Kohler system for 80 years was a magnificent engine for converting what should have been rights into gifts. The right to decent housing became the gift of a company house. The right to organise became the gift of a company union. The right to a say in your own community became the gift of a beautifully governed town you did not govern. Everywhere a worker might have had a right, the family substituted a gift, a better and more beautiful version of the thing, offered with real love, on the condition, never spoken but always present, that you remain the kind of person who receives gifts gratefully, rather than the kind who demands rights. And the strikes, both of them, were finally about nothing more or less than the workers' refusal to keep making that trade, their insistence on converting the gifts back into rights, even at the cost of the beauty, even at the cost of the roses, because a right you hold is worth more than a rose you are given, and some part of every person has always known it. Think before we finish about Lee Wakefield, the young man who by his family's account did not even work at Kohler, who made shoes for another company and came to watch a strike and caught a rifle bullet through the chest, and died at 25 in the most beautiful company town in America. His name is spelled differently in different records. In one or two places the record loses him entirely and puts other names in his place. He is barely remembered, and the town he died in is now known, if it is known at all, for a 5-star hotel and a championship golf course. That is the cost side of the ledger, and it should not be smoothed away by the beauty of the place or the sincerity of the family. 2 men died, and dozens were wounded, and a town spent a generation at war with itself, so that the workers of Kohler could win the ordinary right that workers in most of the democratic world take for granted. The right to bargain as equals rather than to receive as dependents. The roses were real. So was the blood it took to stop having to be grateful for them. So what do you take away from Kohler, Wisconsin, a beautiful town most people have never heard of, built by a family most people could not name, around a fight that most people have forgotten? You take away the thing that the whole saturated genre of company town stories almost never lets you see because it is committed to the easy version with the cruel boss and the noble worker. You take away the fact that the trap does not have to be cruel to be a trap, that the most effective cage is not the one with bars but the one with roses, because you cannot in good conscience hate a jailer who has only ever been kind to you, and a jailer who understands that will give you everything, except the key. The Kohlers were not monsters. That is what makes them worth understanding. They were a family that loved, in its way, the workers and the town it had built, the way a certain kind of father loves a child, completely and controllingly, and without ever quite being able to imagine that the child might have a legitimate will of its own. They gave and they gave and they gave, and the one thing they could never give, because giving it would have ended their whole way of being, was independence. And so the workers had to take it by force, over 30 years, at the cost of 2 lives and thousands of broken friendships and the longest strike in the history of the country, because the only thing a benevolent owner will never simply hand you is the right to no longer need his benevolence. A worker deserves not only wages but roses as well, Walter Kohler said, and he was right, and he meant it, and he built a town to prove it. He just never understood that the deepest thing a worker deserves is not the roses. It is the right to decide whether to accept them, and that was the one rose the family kept for itself, in a locked garden, for 3 generations, until a decade of picket lines finally pried it loose. The house was beautiful, the school was excellent, the town was a garden, and nobody who lived there could ever truly call any of it their own, because it was all, always, a gift, and a gift, however lovely, is not the same thing as a home. If you want the story of another American family that owned everything in sight and then, at the very end, made the opposite choice, choosing to give its great possession away for good rather than hold it, there is a companion piece worth telling next, about an entire island and a family that finally understood the thing the Kohlers never could.